Welcome back to yet another episode for the CB450 build series. And today, as promised, we are going to drop the part 2 episode to the wiring. And again, this is going to be a little less of an interesting episode and more of a episode I'm going to give a try to, or give it a go to, of trying to give you guys context on how all this wiring works and what inputs mean, what outputs mean, what are you supposed to do with the control buttons, what are you supposed to do with the speedometer and getting the speed sensors to work. And basically it's going to be an overview episode of me talking and walking through the general concept of how to wire in your vintage motorcycle with a moto controller from the MotoWorks or an M unit from MOTOGADGET or whatever alternative wiring units there are out there on the market. But essentially they're all generally the same concept, and I just wanted to run through a general overview and give you guys a video that is straight down and dirty, no BS, no crazy like editing, just straight talking and walking you guys through, because I wish I had that when I decided to build the CB750 for the first time ever and decide to wire in a bike for the first time ever, never using wiring tools or wiring components ever before then. So with that, we're going to roll the intro and get right into this episode, and bear with me because I'm going to try to piece all this together the best I possibly could, but I'll catch you back on the tripod right after the intro.
We must pay homage to him.
Okay guys, so this is going to be an episode that I've never done before, an episode that I have knowledge of, but I don't really have the crazy expertise of building motorcycles, especially wiring in motorcycles. But essentially, I'm going to do my best and give you guys all of the I wish I had knowledge or statements when I was first trying to wire, and especially wiring the second bike in, because there's definitely things that I could have done better and things that I wish I had done differently. And also, in addition to that, things that I will plan on my third build to do to make things way more sensible and fluid. So with that, we're gonna kind of bring you over here and I'm gonna show you this electrical tray and what it's all about. Okay guys, so at a very basic level, again, bear with me because I don't really know what the right way to structure this episode is, or structure the way I want to explain things, but this is going to be, about a 15-minute episode of me just talking about how all this stuff works from my knowledge, and hopefully I dumb it down enough to the point where, it's easily digestible and you get an idea of the general concept of how this stuff flows and functions. So you want to start by building an electrical tray of whatever, shape, size, whatever, to your application, and you want to think about a few things. What are some components that you want to contain underneath your cowl, underneath your seat, or whatever it may be, underneath your tank, wherever your bike's frame allows storage for. In this case, the Hondas are real good underneath the seat and the cowl. And basically, you're going to want your battery either underneath your cowl or in the electrical tray area, or sometimes people put it down where the center stand mount is. They make a little box, but for me, it's a lot easier to wire in the positive and negative terminals to be underneath the cowl area. And that's what I've done on the 750 and the 450, and it's worked out perfectly fine. Some of the overall components, like some of the general components that you will always have on these types of motorcycles, are your regulator rectifier, your starter solenoid, your battery, your PDM unit, so M unit or motor controller or whatever alternatives are out there. And that's really about it. Those are 4 main components that you'll have either in or around your electrical tray. In this case of the 450, I have a battery, starter solenoid, main fuse from Rival Cycles, a motor controller from the MotoWorks, and that's it. A simple fuse down here. And I have my regulator rectifier mounted right below here, right about here, right there on the frame. So what you want to consider is the flow and order of operations, right? So from your battery, you need your main engine ground, and you need a positive wire that goes to the starter solenoid. From a starter solenoid, you have your start function. From your starter solenoid, you have your start function, a ground, the positive from the regulator rectifier, and then a positive to the actual M unit or motor controller. And again, I'm going to go dissect all this with the diagrams, but I'm just giving a general overview to start of how this stuff works. And then on your M unit or motor controller, you have two sides to the unit, an input side and an output side. Now, all the wires that you see on the left side here, which is the input side, all come from the push buttons and anything where you're trying to push a button to send a signal to another side. So what that means is you have your push buttons one side and your push buttons on the other side. So that's going to control your head, your light and your high beam, your left and right turn signals, your start button, your configure button for the speedometer, and your horn. Now, there's 6 total up here for me because I have all of the inputs that I just described. Inside these handlebar switches, these ones in particular are from the MotoWorks. Everything will be linked down below. And pretty much the way these set up are universal to all push buttons regardless of brand. On each button, there are 2 terminals. One for the positive colored wire and one for your black negative wire. What that does is allows you to have your colored wire as indicated from the Revival Cycles loom kit. It comes with a full diagram sheet of what colors indicate what and what gauges indicate what and where they go if it's input or output. Now, you take your color to the respective, part. So let's say it's horn, I believe that's orange. And you take your orange wire and you route it all the way back and you plug it in to your horn input. So you have the horn input plugged in from the push button. So when you click the button, it tells the input side to send the signal to the output side. And I'll get there in a moment. You also have on each button, like I said, 2 terminals. One terminal is the colored going into the input side, and the other is the black going to a ground, to ground it. It's always wise to think about setting up your handlebars and anything up front to be serviceable in the future with something like quick disconnect connection. Now that's something I have not quite gotten to the expertise of. In this case, if I had to service, let's say a handlebar bent, or I had to take off a handlebar switch because one of the buttons stopped working, I would essentially have to, take everything apart. It's almost like one loom that is in here, which is for future maintenance not the best to wire it in as, but ideally you want to have, each clip-on have their respective connectors up front, speedometer to have a connector, headlight to have a connector. So if you had to replace anything, you could do it quickly and easily. Now, aside from that, I digress. Like I was saying, each button has a positive and a negative. And that, for the sake of conversation, I used horn as an example. So you're going to take your orange wire, route it back, plug it into the horn input. And you're going to ground that horn to wherever you have your grounding points. Try to keep your controls and try to keep all of your grounding. If you can find a ground bus or build a ground bus that controls all of the functions up front so it cleans up the amount of wires coming back to the electrical tray, I highly recommend trying to do that. And I'll show you what I did as a solution so maybe you guys can get some ideas. But what I'm getting at here is to make the horn actually operate when you push the button, you have to plug in the actual horn wires into the output side. So what does that mean? You have a horn, and then there is a positive and a negative. There's a hot and a ground, just like the handlebar control. So then you wire in the positive from the horn into the output horn output, okay? And then of course, ground it to the respective area in the front of the bike. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, you probably can't see my face, but that's totally fine because I'm just showing you the sake of what this is all looking like. So right here, you see this orange wire right here? If you can, not, I'll zoom in on it. But right here is the input side, the left side of the unit is the input side, and you have the horn, which is right here, okay? You have the push button positive coming back into the horn input side, all right? And that's grounded up front, the switch. As soon as you click that button, it sends a signal from the horn to the output side, which the output side is the actual light horn unit that provides the illumination. So if it's a blinker, you have your wires from the blinker come back and plug into the left or right turn output on the output side. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, one more time I'll explain it because this took me so long to understand. It's like very, very, very simple. You have your push button controls, all right, which are all from the input side. There's a simple ground and a simple 12 volt colored wire that goes into the input side, whatever function, whether it's your key, your left or right turn, your brake light, your headlight, horn, whatever it may be. In addition to the input side, you have the same exact indications on the output side. So you have your left and right turn, your brake, your low beam, your high beam, your horn, your start, blah, blah, blah. Now, in the sake of demonstration, we're talking about the horn. So I have the horn that is grounded and has a 12 volt into the input horn side. And then you have the actual wires from the physical horn being grounded and then coming back to the horn output side. So when you click the button, it sends the signal from the input side on your handlebar controls to the output, which is the physical object. So if it's horn, it's your actual horn. If it's your brake light, it's from your actual, the positive wire from your actual brake light. And then if it's your right turn, it's your actual positive from your right turn signal positive wire. And then everything is, matched up. So you have your blue for the left, and I have my blue for the left, right? And those are all color coordinated from the wire loom kit from Revival Cycles, which I highly, highly recommend you guys getting because it makes the process a little easier because you have things to track and follow with. Let me show you. Okay, so in your Revival Cycles loom kit, and if you decide to get the starter solenoid and main fuse, which I highly recommend because it's very well priced, it comes with everything you need, extra fuses, a diagram, and also a main fuse built in, so you don't have to wire in a main fuse to the harness. You get this beautiful diagram here, and then when you get your wire kit in Deluxe Loom Kit, you also get a indication sheet that tells you, your functions, what it's for, meaning horn, light, brake, turn signal, aux, whatever it is, color, a respective color for each one, and then the gauge of the wire, and then how many feet in quantity you get. In addition to that, you have your inputs, your outputs, and then the power feed, which is very helpful to understand, all right, let's keep things coordinated for the future and also now so we can keep track of what we're doing. Okay, so we're gonna consider that part one of this video. And part one of this video is talking about how push button controls work and how push button controls control and make the actual objects illuminate or make noise or whatever it is, meaning if you have a horn, making a horn horn. If you have a blinker, making a blinker blinker. If you have a headlight, making a headlight turn on. If you have a speedometer, making the speedometer illuminate and operate as it should, right? So it's your inputs are from your controls as an overview, and your outputs are from the 12 volt power from your objects. Moving on to how I try to section off wiring a bike to make it as sensible as possible and to keep track as best as possible. That is starting with a section by section, right? So you have your ignition circuit, you have your starting circuit, you have your function circuit. If I'm leaving something out, let me know, but basically I like to start with what I can wrap my head around first, right? So you put the unit in, you mount your unit, find where it's gonna live. Put your starter solenoid and main fuse, get where that's gonna live. Find where your battery is gonna live, and find where your regulator and rectifier are gonna live. Find where their homes are gonna be, okay? And then start with one thing at a time. What I usually like to do is have my battery in place, get my main engine ground as strong as possible, back to the battery. You want your main engine ground, which comes from your battery, to be mounted to your frame and engine mount. Any one of them, that's just where how it works, okay? To wire in a starter solenoid and main fuse, it honestly is much easier than it seems, and I'm gonna walk you through that process. So if you get your starter solenoid main fuse from Arrival Cycles, which I highly, highly recommend. I've gotten it twice from them now, and it's made the process that much easier. Why? Because of this beauty, okay? And not only do they give you this diagram, they give you a diagram of how to crimp and solder and what to do for the connections to have them as strong as possible, okay? Now, as you can see here, you have your battery, which is right here. Let me put this down. You have your battery, which is right here. You have your starter solenoid, which is right here. I have my stator motor, which is plugged in to my regulator rectifier, and I have my regulator rectifier, all right? You have your starter motor, which this wire is from right here. You use the stock wire, and then you have your regulator rectifier, the 12 volt coming from that, all right? Now, as you can see, right in here, you see this little like rectangle thing? Well, that is where all the plugins go, which is 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the diagram right here, okay? Now, on an M unit, you have 2 start function outputs, and on the motor controller, you just have 1. It's just a slightly different, but same concept. Now, your number 1, which is connected to the fuse, which is your main fuse, is a direct line to the positive terminal on the battery. And then you have for number 2, kind of want to go in order of these numbers right here, okay? On number 2, you have the other main terminal on the starter solenoid and main fuse unit, which is from the starter motor, okay? And then you have 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the center that need to be connected. One's a ground, one is a 12 volt red wire coming from the starter solenoid right to the battery terminal of the M unit or motor controller. And then you have the 12 volt wire, or the red wire, from the regulator rectifier coming up and into input 6 on the starter solenoid. Finally, you have one last function to make it operate, so when you click the button on your handlebar controls, when you click your start button, it sends a signal to the starter solenoid to start and crank the starter motor. And that is plugging in a green wire, depending on if it's an M unit or a motor controller. An M unit has 2, as you can see, 2 here. With the motor controller, you just have 1 green wire. And that goes into the output start port, okay? And then you have, from your push button controls, a positive and a negative, a positive green coming back into the start input. So when you click that button, it sends a signal to the start output, which then sends a signal to the starter solenoid, which then tells the starter motor to crank, yada yada, you get the idea. So that's the general overview of the starter solenoid, how that works, right? Get the Revival Cycles one because of this unbelievably helpful diagram and very seamless process of setting up, okay? All right, so now we can move on. That's our starter circuit, all right? So now that we've moved on to that, we have our regulator rectifier to finalize and connect, okay? All right, so my regulator rectifier is set up right here in the back. You know, traditionally you want to keep a good amount of airflow to your regulator rectifier because they do get hot, and if there's no way for air to circulate, you know, it could potentially get a little too hot. So it's nice to have it mounted in a position where you don't have to worry about that. Now, moving on, with this particular regulator rectifier, there's a few less wires than the CB450. In this case, we have the 12 volt power, we have a black ground, and then we have 3 white wires that connect into our stator. So the whole point of the regulator rectifier is to regulate and then regulate the voltage of the charge from the stator to the battery. And in this case, since we're using a lithium ion battery, you have to be very careful and make sure you order the correct regulator rectifier because the lithium ion batteries are very, very sensitive to charging in a certain volt range, which is different from a lead acid battery. And basically, you take your wires, this is pretty much universal, you take your respective wires from the stator and plug them into a new connector on the regulator rectifier. Now, I get my regulator rectifiers from Rick's Motorsport Electronics regulator rectifiers, and I've had good luck on the last 2 that I've gotten. I've had no issues, and they also provide a great wiring diagram to help you with the process and to make it as seamless as possible. So we went through the push button control concepts. We've went through the starter circuit and we've went through the charging circuit. Next is the ignition circuit. All right, now this brings us to the ignition, last piece to like the sectioned circuits of what needs to be wired in whatever sequence you want, but it's smart to group those things because it helps you have little wins and climb the big mountain of wiring in a much more digestible fashion, because if you're just gonna try to wire everything at once and not be an expert, it could get very overwhelming and very confusing very quickly. So I highly recommend something that has helped me, and I highly recommend grouping certain sections. In a general sense, you have your ignition coils, you have your coils, right? You have your electronic or points ignition, and then you have your spark plug caps and wires that go down to the spark plugs. And in addition to that, depending on if you're running a digital speedometer, you will have one wire from the speedometer that plugs into either the left or right coil, which will read the revolutions per minute from an electronic fashion. So let's break it down real quick. On the unit, on your M unit or motor controller, you do not have an ignition input. You only have an ignition output. So you'll have one wire that comes back, takes the power from both, comes back and plugs into the ignition output, which provides the power. When you turn on your key, the ignition is one of the first things that turns on, and your coils are hot and your ignition's ready, so basically it can fire and send spark when the engine cranks. And the whole idea is the ignition tells the coils when top dead center is, once it's timed properly, and those coils will send the spark to the spark plugs, which then will fire back down the pistons. That's a very bare bones way of explaining it. And now on this bike and the CB750, I ran electronic ignitions on both of them, of which came with wiring diagrams, so it's very straightforward. And the reason why I have went with electronic ignition was just because I actually absolutely despise maintenance, and if I can have something that lowers the amount of things I have to do for maintenance, then I will go ahead and spend the money and do it. In that case, the electronic ignition allows you to pretty much set once and forget your timing, because it's not like points where they have contact wear points and they have to be adjusted or checked every 3,000 or so miles, which is very simple, very straightforward, something I can do very easily. But just for me, if I'm building this bike, I'd like to have an electronic ignition to not really have to worry about it, and all I have to do is really an oil change. Outside of that, the ignition circuit is pretty straightforward. If you buy new or aftermarket coils, comes with your respective wires that have indications of left and right, power, ground, and then in addition to that, you have your electronic ignition, which I got from Charlie's Place for the CB450, and most people know the Dyna company for electronic ignitions and coils. I have the Dyna S2000 on the CB750, and I have the Charlie's Place CB450 electronic ignition on here. Both companies are very solid, provide very in-depth directions, and are very helpful over the phone if you run into any hiccups. Now, if you have any questions at all of what I'm walking through, I know I'm not physically showing you guys because I simply could not do it while I was actually wiring. I didn't have the bandwidth or time or patience to walk you through all of this and have a full wiring series. But basically, I felt this was necessary to walk through because, again, like I said prior in this video, I wish I had a simple video like this that gave me a very general, simple understanding of how all this stuff works, all right? And I understand I am not physically showing you guys a how-to. I wouldn't really consider it a how-to video. It's just more of like a keep in mind video, make you feel a little bit more comfortable video before getting into something you've never done before, because I did so much research before I wired the CB750, watched all the YouTube videos, read all the forums, called all the companies and people, and I never really understood what this stuff meant, because I didn't understand what a 12 volt in the ground and all this stuff, really, I've never wired anything in my life before the 750. So me doing this a second time, I still was a little weary and not super quick with things, but once I got in the groove, I started remembering and understanding that, all right, this stuff really is not that scientific. What's scientific about it is the routing and sophistication of how things are wired in place. And that's what's gonna be the next segment, is tips, tricks, how to route your wires, and what I've learned and what I plan to do in the future for new builds to make things more streamlined. But basically, that's our ignition circuit. It's very straightforward. I know it sounds like a lot, and I'm downplaying it a little bit, honestly. But at the same time, if anyone has any questions, just reach out. But buy the right parts. They come with the right instructions, and you'll be able to call on the phone, and it's honestly really not that bad. Once you understand how the M unit and the moto controller work with inputs and outputs, which I've already went through like 3 times. Again, if you have any questions about that and you need me to explain it in a different way, just let me know in the comments below. But once you understand that general concept, the rest is really just the same, it's just different applications. Moving on to the next segment. One thing that I really tried to do on this bike was make the wiring as sexy as possible. So when I take off my seat, you can look at it and it's perfect. Like, maybe not perfect, but I really wanted to improve on the cleanliness on the wiring on the 450 versus the 750, because the 750 is not the prettiest really way of wiring a bike. It's really just bare bones, comes down to the bike is wired and everything works. So with this, I really wanted to spend a lot of time in thinking of sophisticated ways to route things and use what I learned from the 750 experience and improve on the 450 experience. And one of those things was grounding, having a grounding position for everything in the front of the bike. So I didn't have a ton of wires, extra wires that I didn't need running back to the electrical tray, making it look more cluttered. And how I achieved that was from these little guys right here. I don't know if you can see that, okay? But what these are, I have no idea what they're called. Wago nuts. Wago nuts. And basically, what they are bus channels, right? So you can, what I did was I took one wire from my main engine ground and connected it into one of these. From there, I had, a connection, connect all these Wago nuts. I have about 4 up in the front here, I'll show you. And they're all connected to the main engine ground and all have a respective port for each, push button, for the speedometer, for the headlight, for the brake light switch, for the speed sensor in the front wheel. So there are 2 grounding sections. I have the front and all the components that need to be grounded in the front of the bike. And then I have the main engine ground in the middle of the bike. And then in the back of the bike, I have another one of these Wago nuts that are grounding some of the rear components, like the rear blinkers, the rear brake light, and so on and so forth. So I have it broken up. With the 750, I kind of just had everything coming back, not knowing any better, and it really put way too many wires underneath the electrical tray, making it super hard to route and look clean. Now, another thing that I did not do on this bike, and I haven't really learned yet, is the concept of using connectors for your left control unit, for your right control unit, for your headlight, your speedometer. So when you, for whatever reason, have to go back in and service any of this stuff, you can easily connect it, take off, this left clip on, go from there, and it's super easy. That's not what I did, and unfortunately, the whole harness is basically one, and for me to service this push button control is quite a pain in the butt to get back in there and service it. So I just don't have that knowledge yet, but that's why we're doing it, that's why we're learning, and the third build will be, this build is here, 450 build's here in terms of wiring sophistication, 750's here in terms of wiring sophistication, and hopefully the third bike is just a little better than this in terms of sophistication and serviceability for the future. That's the hard thing about wiring your own bike. You have to think of everything 45 steps in advance and it's really hard to skip a few steps in there because it's hard to wrap your head around everything. And that's where I recommend, if you guys can find a wiring diagram online to print out and follow with a highlighter, or maybe you write your notes down on like a whiteboard or a piece of paper to keep track of things, it will help and make things so much easier. Now, for the final section of this episode, I want to walk through a little tips and trick type of thing that I never really knew about until I started wiring and learning. So one of those things is whenever you have a ground and there's powder coat in the way, you 100% have to clean off the powder coat so there is a good contact from metal to metal on each side of the powder coat. So if there's a bracket, you have to shave the front of the bracket, the back of the bracket, and then the front of the frame or whatever it is that goes to the engine, whatever it may be. You need all the contact points clean so you can have a strong ground. Weak grounds will cause you headaches. Weak grounds will make you chase your tail and think it's more than it is. At the end of the day, if you have a bad ground, that's probably the culprit to what's not working. And that's where with the M unit and the motor controller, there's two mounting bolts, and those are the grounding contact points. It's very important to clear off the contact points underneath the unit where the powder coated electrical tray is. You want to clean that powder coat off where the contact points are for the mount, so the unit is grounded, right? And honestly, that's really about it that I think I should touch on. If I'm forgetting anything, I don't know, maybe I'll make another video, but basically I wanted to come on. Again, I had no real structure for this episode. I'm just talking and kind of trying to think of everything. But basically that should give everyone an encapsulation of how this stuff works in a nutshell. Again, I know I didn't physically show you guys how things plug in, but there are tons of videos out there. I just didn't feel like there was a video out there of anyone just kind of walking through and giving us a bare bones walkthrough of like how this stuff works, what an input does on the M unit or motor controller, what an output does, where those wires come from and where those wires plug into, and you know what products to buy to help make the process a little bit more streamlined and easier, and a little bit of knowledge on how to place these components to make sense for routing and make sense so you're not like, let's say your starter solenoid is up here, but then your regulator rectifier is like up here, and then you have a wire coming from here that has to go back and around and back. So it's just thinking ahead a little bit, doing your best to do that, and not making yourself go crazy, but think about it enough where you can have a sophisticated routing of your wires. But that's basically it for this video. I wanted to say thank you guys for, if you've watched this far, I hope you have learned a little bit, or it's made you feel a little less intimidated to wire your bike with an M unit or motor controller from scratch. There are a lot of things to consider and think about. It's hard to predict for a lot of this stuff, but just keep focused, do your research, watch your videos, reach out to me with any questions, and hopefully you can get your bike wired in and with, you know, not too many issues. So hopefully this video helped you guys. As always, MZR, we're one team, one family. Thank you for being the dopest crew out there. If you enjoyed this video, give a thumbs up. If you're enjoying the build series, consider subscribing if you haven't already to see the last few videos of this finished bike, which will be soon uploaded. And with that, I'll catch you guys in the next episode. And as always, reach out in the comments or DM me on Instagram with any questions at all with what I went through. And if I misspoke or if I missed anything about this stuff, just reach out and I'll try to fix it, resolve it, and give you guys a little bit more insight. So